Welcome back to episode 5 of Matt and Eric Talk Twins. This week, we have a little bit less on the agenda. We have a little bit of an intro on the Rule 5 draft, as well as the winter meetings happening next week. We'll also talk about the Twins draft lottery odds, and then we'll get a little bit deeper into Twins prospect talks and some of the guys who could be impacting the team next year. So, as always, my name is Matt, and I'm here with my co-host, Eric.
How are we doing this week, Matt?
Doing all right. I don't know if I should feel better or worse after this week's news. For those out there who have not heard this week's news, Ken Rosenthal of The Athletic reported that the Twins do not plan to trade Joe Ryan, Pablo Lopez, or Byron Buxton, and that they have mild flexibility to add for next year. So I don't know exactly what that mild flexibility is going to be. Are they going to have $130 million payroll? Are they going to have 150? Or more likely, is it going to be like 110? But what do you think about that one, Eric?
I just continue to be lost by this front office every single day. I wanted them to compete this season, and then they sold everybody at the deadline for pretty disappointing prices, in my opinion. And we came into this offseason after crashing and burning in the second half, and I was ready for them to sell the house and build up a mega farm. And then we started seeing some of these deals fall into place, like the Jose Ferrer for Harry Ford deal, or getting the password back for Oviedo. And all of a sudden, it looked like we are going to have a happy Christmas in Twins territory. And now we're just not trading any of our guys. And that should make us ecstatic because it's going to be the quickest path towards being good again. But I was just getting ready to part ways with all these guys and starting to actually kind of look forward to the super team we could create in our minor leagues. And now we're just kind of back to square one again, it feels like.
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like a half measure. Like you mentioned, I think I've been taken aback by some of the trade costs recently. Harry Ford was just traded for like a good setup man, like a decent lefty reliever, and he would have been the best prospect traded at the deadline, like maybe not. Leo Dallas DeVries got traded, but he was one of the better prospects at the deadline. I don't know. Part of me is like, this team wasn't very good the last couple years. They have the opportunity to tear it down, turn some of these pieces they still have around into impact talent for the future. And now it just kind of seems like they're going to roll out the same group, or at least a very similar looking group next year. And I don't really know what the point of that is. Like, your team's already been pretty rough for a couple years, and now we're going to roll with largely the same options with a couple of minor league promotions coming up. It just seems like a losing strategy.
I guess if you want to give the front office credit, I feel like I was one of many fans that were thinking the Twins could have been certainly division contenders, if not more, in 25 had we seen Pablo and Luke Keeschel stay healthy all season. And obviously we have a long ways to go to even just build back up to the roster we were fielding in 2025. But the Twins did their normal thing. They started slow, and then they looked like the best team in baseball for about a month before the injuries started getting them. So, as we've been saying all off season, there is still a path for the Twins to be good next year. And I think that is ultimately going to lie in what exactly that modest amount of spending the Twins have in their pocket is.
Yeah, even still, like from the reporting I've seen, it looks like the Twins payroll is going to be below the 130-ish that they ended last year with, which again was $30 million less than they spent in 2023. So the payroll is going to be diminished either way. Right now, it's right around 95 million. If we see them getting up to like 115, that would give them $20 million to spend, we've walked through a lot of the available options in the bullpen and at first base. Realistically, I think we could probably see them add a first baseman and two relievers for $20 million, but it wouldn't be high end guys. It would be players that make their team better, but aren't going to replace the value that all the guys we shipped out at the deadline had.
To me, this is where our depth in our farm system needs to shine and really be relied upon by Falvey, because $20 million, not a lot, but it's definitely enough to go out and get a impactful player. If we put all 20 million or close to that in our AAV towards one impactful player, you could definitely go out there and get a guy like Juanito Suarez, who, as we highlighted, would be a fantastic fit playing kind of that first third base flip position for the Twins in not just this year, but really the coming years, because they don't have anybody in the system that is pounding the door to take over either of those locations. And it fills the largest need that the Twins don't have a direct answer for. I think anywhere else you look on the diamond, especially now that they brought back Trevor Larnach, you have in-house options that could fill the roster in a competitive and fairly respectable manner in 26. So I would like to see the Twins just take all that money, take one shot at one player, and even if that doesn't pan out for us this year, it's still a tradable contract, assuming it would be on that higher AAV, low long-term type of deal that the Twins have been enjoying to make.
Yeah, I think you bring up a good point. Any success that the Twins have this year and in the near future is going to come from players in their farm system. That's part of the reason that we wanted to talk through a lot of the players that we kind of offhandedly mentioned on this podcast. I think Eric and I spend a lot of time reading articles and freshening up on our prospect knowledge, but for some of the more casual listeners and fans out there, it'd probably be good to have a little bit of a refresher on who these guys are, what we can expect from them, and just who we have for reinforcements coming up. Like Eric mentioned, there's not really a whole lot of options at first base on the horizon. The Twins have a pretty solid number of starting pitchers and especially outfielders that'll be up within the next year or two, but the infield's looking a little rough. So before we fully transition into our prospect talk, I think we can spend a little bit of time on the Rule 5 draft. So the Rule 5 draft will be happening next week at the winter meetings. The winter meetings, for those of you who don't know, is sort of just like a industry convention. Every team in baseball gets a room at this hotel. They'll get a big suite, and it just gets all of the industry people under one roof. They usually have some sort of job fair, so a lot of recent college graduates will go there, and there'll be a bunch of 20-something-year-olds walking around in suits and ties and trying to find someone to hire them. There'll also be all of the front office people working to kind of get a feel for the landscape of free agency and the trade market. A lot of times we see some of the big blockbuster deals of the winter happen at the winter meetings. So I would expect there to be quite a bit of movement next week. But one of the smaller things that they do every year is called the Rule 5 draft. So the Rule 5 draft, I believe these are the criteria to qualify, but it's any player who was drafted out of high school or signed as an international free agent who's been in the organization more than 5 years, or college players who've been in the organization more than 4 years. If they're still not on a team's 40-man roster, they're eligible to be selected by other teams in baseball, immediately added to their 40-man, and then kept on their team for the following year. So the one downside with this is if you select a player in the 40-man or in the Rule 5 draft, not only do they have to take up a 40-man roster spot, but they also have to be on your 26-man active roster for the entirety of the following season. So it's a little bit of disincentive for teams to just take a bunch of talent from other teams, but it gives an opportunity for guys who might be stuck behind a big talent, but they are big league ready, gives them an opportunity to play for another organization. That's a little bit of a refresher on what the Rule 5 draft is and what the winter meetings are. And we'll get a little bit more into the Twins specific side of things.
I'm just really excited that the Twins are participating in the Rule 5 draft again. Obviously, for a lot of the reasons Matt outlined, it's not a very often used draft. I would say, normally, I believe only 10 to a dozen players at most that get picked. And almost all those guys are going to be picked to teams that are in a situation like the Twins, where unfortunately they're rebuilding now. There's a lot of roster turnover and a lot of question marks. But that also makes this kind of fun. I mean, we picked up Iverson Castellano in the Rule 5 draft last year. I don't even know if he made it to July. But prior to that, we haven't had a Rule 5 pick for the Twins since 2017. And even if it's like trying to pick a needle in a haystack, at the end of the day, it is a quirky little addition to the MLB that I appreciate, because it's just another avenue to try and funnel hope to the hopeless right now.
Yeah, I mean, largely the teams we see taking advantage of this are those somewhat devoid of talent who have a lot of opportunity to give guys playing time. Most often, guys who are picked are relievers. A lot of bad teams don't keep around decent relief pitchers, so they have innings to give to these guys. I think that's where it's really interesting for the Twins. Obviously, they traded almost all of their bullpen at the deadline, and now they're really going into next season with 4 options in the pen that you feel good about. So having the opportunity to select a guy or two that they think might have some upside and be able to pitch at least low leverage innings out of the bullpen seems like a good opportunity for them. So currently the Twins hold the 5th overall pick in the draft. Honestly, trying to pick which prospects they might be interested in or might be looking at is a little bit hard to do. Just by nature, the guys who are available in the Rule 5 draft aren't top prospects. They're not super heralded. A lot of times it just comes down to what organizations' internal models think of guys. If they might see something that most people don't, they will select them and try to develop that player. So it's hard to say who the Twins might be interested in, but just generally having a high pick and their current bullpen situation, there's reason to think that they're going to add someone.
That was the same exact thought that I had approaching this Rule 5 draft this year. Specifically, I know that most often teams, if they do target a pitcher, either have just a glaring need in their rotation that they can afford to experiment with the Rule 5 pick, or they're going to try and do something similar to what the Twins did last year with Castellanos, where they tried to just kind of bury him at the end of the roster, stash him as a long relief mop up type of pitcher. But I think the Twins have a really exciting opportunity this year with such an empty bullpen to really just take anybody, with the expectation that if they have a good camp, they could very easily work their way into a legitimate role on the team this year. Specifically, when I was looking at candidates in the Rule 5 draft, I am looking at some of the left-handers that got left unprotected. Right now, outside of Connor Prelip, who we'll touch on later in the episode, we really only have one functional left-handed reliever that I think could start the season on the roster in 2026, that being Cody Funderburk. And he's not really a guy that you need to, like, if he's on the roster, that's nice, but he's not a guy that needs to be on the roster. He's a guy that definitely could be well served being pushed for some competition coming out of camp, and I think that is in my opinion, the most exciting avenue for the Twins to pursue here in the Rule 5 draft.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. Just it's not to say that the Rule 5 draft doesn't sometimes hit, but generally the expectations should be pretty low. There's usually a reason that these guys are kept off of other teams' 40-man rosters. There's usually something in their profile that's not to like. and some reason to doubt that they can be effective in the big leagues. However, I think for the Twins specifically, they've had a lot of luck building their team through the Rule 5 draft. They've had some big wins, namely with Johan Santana, also with Ryan Presley, Shane Mack back in the day. And then on the kind of smaller side, guys like Scott Diamond, who can come in and just be a decent arm. Not necessarily saying that the Twins need a Scott Diamond type, as we've talked about. They have a million starting pitchers, but hopefully they can find a Ryan Presley type to at least be a serviceable middle reliever. Also at the winter meetings, we have the draft lottery. So this was a new initiative a few years ago for the MLB to avoid teams tanking specifically for the number one overall pick. This way, the top 6 picks are decided in a lottery format. There's more rules and stipulations where teams who are luxury tax payers or recipients can get their picks bumped back further in the draft if they're in the lottery consecutive years. We won't get into all of that, but the thing to know for the Twins is that they currently have the second highest odds at the number one overall pick in the draft, behind only the White Sox. And I believe their odds are something like 22% to get that 101. And they are, I think, guaranteed at least a top 7 pick.
The Twins have, in the short history of this lottery at least, normally been looked down upon pretty favorably. The first year that the lottery was implemented was probably our most notable jump. We jumped, I believe it was about 7 picks, landed ourselves in the top 5, and that set us up in a draft that was considered to have a clear and consensus top 5 to walk away with Walker Jenkins, who is now just absolutely tearing up every level of the minors and looks like he's just an absolute stud of the future. So hopefully we can make a smaller jump, but still a jump nonetheless, to get up to that first overall pick in a draft that feels like it has a consensus first overall.
Also, as we touched on, the Twins could use some infield help, and the consensus 101 this year is a college shortstop from UCLA named Rock Chalowski. He has an absolutely phenomenal name. Would love to talk about a guy named Rock all the time, but he is both an above average defender at shortstop, but also, I think more importantly for the Twins, he's a guy that has a lot of impact in his bat. He covers the strike zone well. He doesn't strike out all that much. He's fairly selective at the plate, but he has, I think MLB.com put 70 grade power on his power tool. So he could be a real middle of the order 25, 30 homer guy while playing shortstop. A lot of times in prospect circles, a guy who's large enough to have that sort of power while also being small and agile enough to be a capable defensive shortstop is known as the Goldilocks zone. I think that phrase was coined when Carlos Correa and Corey Seager were coming up through the minors as real large bodied shortstops who could really hit. And I think Rock Chalowski has the chance to be that kind of Goldilocks shortstop. So really hoping the Twins have the chance to select him.
You definitely don't want to oversell a guy that hasn't even made it to the MLB yet, but it's hard not to get caught up in all the excitement that's surrounding this guy. MLB.com's Jonathan Mayo, when he was doing his write-up recently, suggested that he might be the best shortstop prospect that has been seen since Troy Tulowitzki came out in 2005. There are multiple scouting directors that believe Rock could have been a first-round pick coming out of high school. So for him to have bypassed that opportunity to go to college, play at UCLA, and put up the monstrous numbers that everybody expected, it's, like I said, really easy to dream on this talent, and it's talent that you wouldn't even need to dream that long on. This looks like a guy who's going to be in your system, and you can never count on a guy to work and move as fastly as Walker Jenkins, because what he's done in ascending through our organization is also just transcendent. But it's hard not to look at the talent there and think that you could see a similar type of ascent for a guy like Rock Chalowski.
Yeah, especially because Chalowski's coming out of college. He's played at UCLA for the last 3 years versus Walker Jenkins, was a high school guy who those talents kind of they tend to take a longer time to get to the big leagues. I think Chalowski, we could probably see an ascent pretty similar to Brooks Lee. I think it was right around a year and a half after he was drafted that he was first debuting in the big leagues. And so, honestly, if a year and a half from the draft would be, what is that, like the fall of 2026, like August of 2026, that would be pretty good. That'd be a quick climb for a guy who could potentially be a middle of the order hitter.
Certainly. And he's not like exactly a super young prospect. He's entering his third year, his first draft eligible year at the age of 20. I believe that would have him on pace to be 21 when he's drafted. And Walker Jenkins was in AAA as a 20-year-old last year. I think most top prospects, you're going to see them up in the big leagues by 23, 24 at the latest. So I think that it would be a great pickup for the Twins because not only is he a transcendent talent, but a lot of the rest of this talent at the top of the draft looks like it's leaning more towards another high school prep hitter type of draft, which wouldn't be the worst thing for the Twins, but certainly is a little more frustrating from time to time as a fan base.
Yeah, I think most importantly, and we might be putting the cart before the horse because, again, we don't know if the Twins will have the number one overall pick. So we might be spending a bunch of time talking about Rock Chalowski for him to not even be available for the Twins. But I think one thing that Eric and I have talked about in the past being something that frustrates us about the Twins' draft strategy is they tend to prioritize guys who can play up the middle, be center fielders, be shortstops, catchers, that sort of thing, over their ability to hit. So a lot of times what happens is you draft a guy like Brooks Lee thinking, well, this guy can probably hit. He's a serviceable shortstop. All he has to do is be able to stick it short and hit a little bit, and he'll be a very valuable player. And then a couple years down the road, you go, I don't know if I really want to play this guy at short. And he's still not hitting. He doesn't really have that kind of power that you'd want at second or third. And you end up with just kind of a middling player. And I think Chalowski helps the Twins avoid that because he's a guy whose bat will play wherever on the field you put him, and he happens to also be able to be a capable shortstop. So it allows all of his tools to kind of play off of each other, and there's less pressure on any one specifically.
Fortunately, though, for all of you Falvey supporters out there, if the Twins do miss out on the first overall pick, the next three top ranked prospects, according to Mayo, are also shortstops. We have two prep shortstops in Grady Emerson and Jacob Lombard, who is the younger brother of George Lombard Jr., a name that I personally have been trying to link in Twins trade talks for quite some time now. And the also very well named Justin LeBron. If you're gonna miss out on a guy like Rock Chalowski, getting LeBron in your organization is a pretty good consolation prize.
Question for you, Eric: is Emerson related to Colt Emerson, the infield prospect for the Mariners?
I would have to believe so, just because anytime I see names that pop up like that, especially in a game like baseball, it just feels way too coincidental for two guys with the same name of roughly the same age to both be really, really good at baseball.
Yeah. Also, the Rockies outfield prospect Charlie Condon, his little brother, I forget what his name is, like Justin Condon, something like that, is also sort of a late first round prospect coming out of Georgia high school. So there's always some bloodlines at play. It seems like in the draft.
We've certainly seen that in the past few years with both the Holiday brothers and Justin Crawford's kid, another guy I'm a big fan of. But I am enjoying seeing all these names pop up because it's starting to make me feel a little bit old, but it's almost comforting in a way because it's a lot of recycled names that we grew up on that a whole nother generation's also going to get to grow up on for a very different reason. But I think anytime you have family success in the MLB or really any pro sport, it's really fun to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I remember a few years ago when the Blue Jays wave of prospects were coming up. They were known as like the nepotism babies because they had just a million guys who were named after, or well, they were the sons of big league fathers. Like they had Kevin Biggio, obviously Bo Bichette, and Vlad Jr. I believe they also had, I don't know if they had Cody Clemens at some point, but he was around at that time. There's just always a few big leaguers' kids, I feel like, in the big leagues. Which, by the way, I love the Cody Clemens moment where he struck out Shohei. I don't know if you saw. I think Roger Clemens tweeted something about like it's the most impressive strikeout anyone in the Clemens family has.
If we give Roger Clemens one at bat against Shohei Ohtani, who's winning that?
Shohei.
Yeah,
I think you give Roger Clemens one at bat against like any pitcher in baseball right now, and that pitcher's winning.
Oh, I meant with Clemens pitching and Shohei hitting, but
yeah,
that makes I'm not trying
sense.
To put Roger Clemens in the box.
I was like, dude, I don't think a 50-year-old Roger Clemens is doing anything against anyone.
No, we're gonna say prime. We'll even give him juiced Roger Clemens. Needs to get one out on Shohei Ohtani. Is he getting it done?
Yeah, I mean, Roger Clemens is one of the best pitchers in baseball. And I mean, even Shohei facing like the wide swath of big leaguers is like, a 310 hitter. If he has a 400 on base, he's still getting out 60% of the time. He's facing a better than average arm. I'll give it to Roger.
Fair enough. So I'll give you one more hypothetical here. We are going to put Roger in the box, but we're having his son pitching to him. If he can strike out Shohei Ohtani, he should have no problem striking out his own dad, right?
I think the Cody Clemens ephus is a plus pitch. He's going to get it done.
Another bullpen option we could explore if we do get in a first base bat to replace him.
Hey, dude, I know I was really stumping for the Twins to re-sign Jonah Bride, but he's going somewhere else.
I'm pretty sure Joey Gallo is still free, though. You want to talk about that weird Twins pipeline starting to form of former washed-up first baseman to converted pitcher?
Yeah, we should just go get Anthony Ghost, too. Just all of the old outfielders. I think Tyler Naquin's pitching somewhere, too. Get him in here. Hey, Ghost and Naquin are left-handed options. They can be there with Funderburk.
I would have about as much confidence as I do in Funderburk, if we're being honest.
Yeah, no, I agree. Okay, we're getting a little bit off topic, so I think we can transition over to the Twins minor league. Obviously, the first guy that we're going to talk about, someone that I'm sure you all know, love, Walker Jenkins. We just talked about him a few minutes ago. Twins took him in the first round a couple years ago in 2023. He's a guy who was a big benefit for the Twins to be able to jump from the 13th pick in the draft up to 5 to take. It was widely thought at the time that he was a number 1 overall pick talent in a different draft class. So it was a giant stroke of luck for the Twins to end up with him. He is affectionately referred to as Captain America. He's 6'3", 215. He's built like a brick, you-know-what house. And he has always been thought to be a guy who can develop into really top-of-the-charts power. I mean, he's 6'3" and looks like Superman. So you would think that he's going to be able to hit the crap out of the ball. And really the interesting thing of his profile so far is he's been more of a contact hitter through the minors. He's posted low strikeout rates, really high in-zone contact rates, as well as just exceptional overall production. He's been more gap-to-gap and less homer power, but you would think for a guy who's only 20 years old, he will grow into more of that power long-term.
Now, we've talked about this before. I'm always a little bit skittish of the Twins getting their hands on guys that they believe need to hit for more power and trying to correct that mistake themselves. It has not gone that great in the past few years. I think that's a general philosophy that we've seen in the organization with players like Austin Martin and Jose Miranda, even little bit of Edouard Julian, who was definitely more of a contact hitter coming up through the minors. And for a lot of those guys who were already fringe top prospects like Miranda and Julian, jury's out on whether or not that was really a Twins development issue or just the player really not being as great as some of us hoped they might be. But even for a guy who feels as undeniable as Walker Jenkins, I am really worried about anybody who's putting in serious work with the Twins development staff right now.
Yeah, I will say, and you kind of mentioned it, Walker Jenkins is several tiers of prospects ahead of either of those guys. And he, if you just look at his pedigree as a fifth overall pick out of high school and making it all the way up to AAA as a 20-year-old and producing at every stop along the way, guys who do that, regardless of organization, regardless of a lot of factors, generally are good big leaguers. Guys who have this kind of ascension through the minors hit way more often than the average prospect. And so I feel pretty good about Walker Jenkins. I think the Twins will take it a little slower with him this year, in part because they don't want to rush him through the minors, but also they have a lot of outfield options. I could see him staying in the minors through maybe July, coming up sometime in July. But he's a guy that could definitely factor into the Twins' plans this next year.
I think it's certainly not a question of if, but rather when. It's something that I know Aaron Gleeman of The Athletic touched on recently, but even for some of the league's top prospects, it feels like call-ups in the middle of the season tend to be more need-based rather than want-based. It's pretty rare that we see a player who's just so undeniably, unbelievably good at the AAA level that they just need to be in the major leagues tomorrow, and you're going to move pieces of your team to get it done. But the way that Walker Jenkins has adapted and thrived at every level, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that he could be one of those guys. So even if he doesn't make the opening day roster, which is a very big long shot for him, there's not a lot of talent for him to beat out to get there. I mean, if we see Trevor Larnach continue to be Trevor Larnach and put up uh almost on the dot league average OPS plus WRC plus, I think that we could see Walker Jenkins shockingly early than I think a lot of fans would expect.
Yeah, another thing to consider with Jenkins, because he is such a high caliber prospect, the Twins are incentivized to have him on the opening day roster if he's going to be up for most of the season, because that would make him eligible for the prospect promotion incentives, which could give the Twins, I think, an extra first round pick if he were to finish in the top three of Rookie of the Year, or is it top three of MVP or win Rookie of the Year?
I
It's something like that.
believe it's that second one you mentioned, being a top three MVP vote getter or winning Rookie of the Year.
Yeah, and so there's always the potential that the Twins could keep Jenkins down for a little while, and then he comes up and is just so good that he could win Rookie of the Year anyways, in which case the Twins miss out on that extra first round pick. However, if the Twins keep him down, I think even into like the middle of April, they earn an extra year of control on him. So it could be an interesting situation there. Honestly, he wasn't real great in AAA last year. He held his own, and it was late in the season, so I think there's probably a lot of just wear and tear taking its toll by then. But I don't know that I would necessarily be pushing for him to be on the opening day roster, but it's definitely something to consider. It's also a situation where we could see him get an extension before ever making it to the big leagues. I don't know that that's super likely, but we have seen other teams do that in this situation where they have a guy who's close and they probably otherwise would keep him in AAA to earn the extra year. but they can give him a big deal, lock up that long-term control, and then also try to get that first-round pick if they hit right away.
I certainly wouldn't mind seeing the Twins take that route with Walker Jenkins. It's obviously been a very, very mixed bag in the past, something I don't believe the Twins have ever explored for themselves. But it really just feels unrealistic with the team that is already on a shoestring budget that potentially might be trying to even downsize from that budget to fit even an extra 2 to 3 million a year onto the roster for Walker Jenkins when that's just not something they have to do.
Right. Okay, number 2 on the list is another left-handed hitting outfielder named Emmanuel Rodriguez. He's a guy who the Twins signed out of the Dominican Republic in 2019 for a $2.5 million signing bonus. He's a little bit smaller than Jenkins in stature. He's about 5'10", 215. He's 22 and a half years old, and he has spent all of this past year and most of the year before in AAA. Now, you might be asking, why is he spending so much time in AAA if he's such a good prospect? And it's injuries. He is pretty much always hurt. He's averaged, I think, like 50 or 60 games per season throughout his minor league career. So it's been a variety of issues. But when he's on the field, he is one of the more unique players in the minors. He has huge raw power. He also walks a ton. He has the highest walk rate in the minors, but he also strikes out a lot. A lot of that is because he's taking so many pitches. He's taking a lot of strikes. He's working deep into counts. But he also has a lot of swing and miss in his profile. He's a guy that you can probably expect to be, 30, 35% strikeout rate guy, even in the big leagues. But the hope is he does enough damage with pitches in the zone to be an above average hitter, and he's going to walk a lot.
I would certainly say that when the pitcher's best option pitching to you is to actually fill up the zone and make you swing the bat, you're doing something pretty right as a prospect generally. And it's fascinating to me because we were just talking about this recently with Austin Martin about how the mark of having a higher on base percentage than a higher slugging percentage is a curse that pretty much no player is going to overcome. If you're slugging at that low of a rate, it's going to be extremely hard for you to be a valuable player, no matter how good that on base percentage might be. But if there's a guy that's ever going to buck that trend, it would be Emmanuel Rodriguez. I mean, in his 52 games at AAA last year, he did just that. He had a higher on base percentage than slugging percentage to the tune of an 852 OPS because this guy has a 429 on base percentage. I understand that there's going to need to be some adjustments in terms of pitch selection, but he's already doing the hard part for the Twins. He's showing an elite eye. He's showing elite discipline. He's showing the ability to lay off bad pitches. I think the Twins just need to build his confidence inside of the zone and really kind of perk up his ability to be aggressive early in the count, something that obviously doesn't come naturally to a guy that likes to watch so many pitches go by. But if he can stay healthy, he's got the makings of another player who could potentially be a shockingly good player really early into 2026.
Yeah, there's 2 comps that I come back to a lot with Erod. One, actually, honestly, both Twins fans probably won't like, but I think stylistically he's very similar to both Joey Gallo and Edouard Julien, but in a better way. I think he's a lot like early career Joey Gallo, where he's going to walk a lot, hits for a ton of power, and he's legitimately plus in the outfield. He's a guy that you wouldn't necessarily think would be an above average defender. But he's a guy that, while he's kind of a stocky 5'10 player, he makes a lot of flashy plays out there. He has more range than you would think. He gets really good reads off the bat. He's, I think, presently at least average, but probably bordering on plus territory in center field. The expectation is that he'll probably slow down a little bit and have to settle to just be an above average right fielder. But in that situation, he's a lot like Joey Gallo, where he's going to play Gold Glove defense in a corner. He'll hit a lot of home runs. He'll walk a lot. He'll strike out a lot. Um, and then just in terms of his overall approach at the plate, he's so passive that it sometimes hurts him. And that's kind of something we saw a lot with Eddie Julian, where it almost looks like he's trying to get walked when he's hitting. He's letting a lot of pitches go that he could probably do damage on. However, where it's kind of unraveled for Julian is that pitchers realize they can fill up the zone against him, and he'll probably take pitches. And the worst that happens is maybe a double in the gap. And honestly, he hasn't punished pitchers in the zone for the last 2 years. I don't think that's going to be a concern for Erod, just because, as we've said, he does have well above average power. And so he does enough in the zone to be able to command pitchers' respect. You can't just lay a fastball in there because he could hit it 30 rows deep to right.
I think the other key difference between Eddie Julian and Erod as a prospect is the speed factor, because on top of Eddie Julian, like you mentioned, not exactly being a dangerous threat when you're putting the ball in the zone, even if he is getting on base, he's not going to light up the base paths. He is maybe an okay runner, but he's not a guy that you're particularly worried about giving up a single or a double to because you mislocated a ball down the middle of the zone. Emmanuel Rodriguez does have the potential to have the type of speed that is turning a walk into a double, that is legging out these bloop singles, these line drives that are a little lazy into the outfield from singles to doubles. He's the type of guy that puts pressure on the pitcher and the defense before he even gets on base. And that is certainly a skill that I don't think Eddie Julian ever really possessed, even as a prospect.
Yeah. Moving on to the next guy on the list, we have Connor Prelip. He's a really interesting story. The Twins drafted him in the second round out of Alabama a couple years ago. He was a guy who's generally thought of as in contention to be a first round pick, and even the number one overall pick in his draft class. Unfortunately, he ran into a string of injuries. He got Tommy John surgery while at Alabama and missed most of his platform season. The Twins grabbed him in the second, gave him some pretty healthy bonus money to come aboard. And since then, he has gotten another Tommy John surgery, but he is back healthy. He pitched most of last year at various levels in the minors, making it all the way up to AAA. He's a guy who has a lot of velocity from the left side and probably the best slider in minor league baseball. It's super tight with RPMs getting over 3,000. And he has good enough command that a lot of people think he could be an impact starting pitcher. But again, he's had so many injury issues that he hasn't really built up that workload like you'd like to see from a starter. And there's a lot of thought that he could just immediately be a shutdown weapon in the bullpen. And I think just from what we've talked about in our last few episodes, that's probably where he's going to end up. I don't know that you can expect him to hold up as a starter over a full season. And honestly, there might not be that many bullets left in his arm based on his injury history. So I would love to see him up pretty soon this year and see what he can do for the Twins.
So I alluded to Connor Prelip earlier in the show, and for those that have been paying attention, there's been a very long-running joke between me and Matt Canarino. Matt Canarino was probably my very first underdog. This is a deep dive prospect, a guy that's not getting a lot of national attention love, that I was just all over. The second he was in the Twin system, I thought he had all of the command, he had all of the stuff, he had all of the velocity, everything he needed to be an elite shutdown reliever. And every single year, I would grow more and more frustrated watching the Twins try to continue to stretch him out as a starter when his arm was already clearly struggling with that workload. And unfortunately, in the Matt Canarino situation, it just never worked out. Too many injuries piled up. He lost just too much stuff while he's still in the organization. I don't think he really holds a lot of that value anymore. Connor Prelip is my new Matt Canarino. I think it is absurd that with all the pitching depth they already have, both in the major leagues and waiting at the AAA level, that they are going to continue to try and drag out the Connor Prelip starter experiment. Even if he could stay healthy enough to be a starter, there's enough concerns about his command and potentially his arsenal past his 1-2 fastball slider combo that it's just ridiculous to even try to continue and waste time on developing him as a starter prospect when I'm convinced that he could be our number one lefty and potentially even the best reliever we have in the bullpen opening day if the Twins so choose.
Yeah, it's kind of a similar story to John Duran when he was coming up. He was a back end top 100 prospect, a guy who had struggled with some injuries, and the Twins just ended up moving him to the bullpen right away at the start of his rookie year, and he was our closer by the middle of July. Could definitely see the same thing happening here with Prelip. And actually, earlier this offseason, Derek Falvey was giving an interview talking about some of the Twins' bullpen options, and he specifically called out Connor Prelip and another guy we'll talk about later, Marco Raya, as guys that they could see filling impact roles for the team this year.
It's certainly a situation where it's going to have to be somebody. The Twins have not been wrong in the way that they've pursued adding pitching depth to their farm system. But the flip side of that is when you have developed the arms as well as they have, and they were all coming into the system at roughly the same time, they all need somewhere to go to. And at the end of the day, I would rather see these guys pushing for spots in a major league bullpen than just settling in as AAA regulars, quad A starters, taxi type of guys for the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah. The next guy on our list is Kalen Culpepper. The Twins took him in the first round a couple years ago in 2024 out of Kansas State. He's almost 23 years old. He's about 6 foot, 185. He's a shortstop. He's a guy who has hit a little bit more than expected for the Twins. He hit throughout college, but there's some doubt as to whether he'd really be an impact hitter. All he's done is produce since putting on a Twins uniform. He's smashed through all minors, all levels of the minors that he's been exposed to thus far. Ending this past season in, I think, did he make it up to AAA at the end of last year?
He did not. He fell just short, but he got a pretty good run in AA.
Yeah, I know he was a guy who was under consideration for a late season call up, and it looks like they ended up just sticking with him in AA. But he was a great player there for the Twins. He's a guy who has exceeded expectations defensively. When he was first drafted, there was some doubt whether or not he would be able to be a viable shortstop. I think for the most part, that has kind of settled down. He looks to be at least an average shortstop, maybe a little bit above average. He's a guy who makes the most out of his physical attributes, and he's gotten to quite a bit of power in the minors. I'm not saying he's going to be a 25, 30 homer guy, but a guy that you can expect to hit 15 to 20 homers. He might strike out a little bit, but thus far he's just produced.
Yeah, I think that Kalen Culpepper is a prime example of the type of prospect that Matt was kind of warning against towards the start of the episode about these kind of tweener guys the Twins have gone after that might not stick defensively at shortstop, but would struggle to carry a bat anywhere else. And it's been fascinating to see Culpepper grow as a prospect because he is lightly growing out of that shortstop label. I think certainly for many organizations, they would like to at least try to keep him as a shortstop long term. But for the Twins, who already have Brooks Lee in the major leagues and Merrick Houston, who they just picked up in the draft, I think they would be more apt to move him out of short. But the flip side of that is, as Matt mentioned, he's really been able to pick up the bat to the point where even if he moves outside of shortstop, you could still see him being a productive everyday major leaguer into his career. To me, this gives a lot of similar vibes to a early career Jorge Polanco, a guy that came up as a shortstop, but was always kind of stretched there. And as he kind of lost that ability to play a premium position, he did pick up a lot of bat to ball skills. And in the later stage of his career, even a little bit of power. He did pop 26 home runs with the Mariners last year. But I think it's promising to at least see a surefire, no doubt, positive development case out of the Twins farm system here.
Yeah, and he's another guy too who is probably going to factor into the Twins' plans next year. Which, if you haven't noticed, the top four guys we've talked about are all guys we should see in the majors. That's one of the main things to kind of make us enthusiastic about the next year's Twins team. We have some guys who are really talented and are going to be long term pieces that the Twins need to succeed. And we should see them as soon as this year. And Culpepper is a guy who is going to be playing into that infield mix at some point in the second half of this season. Um, he could potentially take over at shortstop from Brooks Lee. He could play some second base if Lee is playing well at short. He could play some third if Royce Lewis is hurt, as tends to happen. So he's a guy who we could definitely see and add some more talent to probably our weakest positional group. Um, so I'm pretty excited about Culpepper. For the next guy we're going to talk about, it is Eduardo Tayit. You likely already know a little bit about Tayit after he was the headliner of the John Duran trade. He is a back end top 100 type prospect. And he generally has a profile that I am not a fan of. So he's a 19-year-old catcher in A ball. Generally, high school age catchers in pro baseball don't work out. However, there is a lot of upside to like about Tayit. He has a thunderous bat. He has a lot of power. He gets to do it pretty well. He's an athletic guy. And there's at least some thought that he can be an average-ish or a little bit above average as a catcher. He's getting better every year. His receiving has gotten a lot better. He's athletic behind the plate. And a lot of the things that he's not great at are coachable for catchers. You know, he's not the greatest blocker, but he's a guy who's athletic behind the plate. So it's likely about coaching some better form and honestly some want to get in front of the ball and understand how to put himself in the best position to block everything coming at him. But he's a guy who there's a lot of projectability. We can see him potentially being an impact hitter as well as a good defender at the hardest position in baseball to play. So it makes sense why the Twins took a big swing bringing him in. But again, it's risky just in that he's 19, he's a catcher, and there's a lot of development to happen before he can be in the big leagues.
Yeah, this is one that we fall very much on the same page on. During the trade deadline this last year, I was screaming, pounding the table for Harry Ford. It just made all the sense in the world. And as we saw just this week, clearly something that the Mariners were pursuing at the deadline and still ended up pursuing when they dumped off Harry Ford for Ferrer to the Nationals earlier this week. But it's like Matt said, when you have a guy ranked and touted so highly as at such a young age as catcher, it really feels like the only place for his prospect stock to go is down. He's already the obviously number 5 prospect on Fangraph's top 20 prospects for the Twins. I think he ranks as high as number 3 in MLB.com's rankings. He's one of 4 guys that falls on the top 100 prospect list from MLB.com for the Twins. And that's such lofty expectations for a guy that just really hasn't even done anything, which is not his fault at all. He's only 19 years old, and he's still playing and holding his own at high A ball, which is a league that on average is going to be 21, 22-year-old, like guys fresh out of college who have maybe, or guys who've been struggling through their high school development. are playing at. So in the short run, in the short run, we just have to wait and see. There's not going to be a lot of new developments, I feel like, on Eduardo Tait. Even if he has a poor year, that doesn't necessarily mean that his stock is going to drop super far south like he can for a lot of other prospects. But we're going to be talking about this guy as a potential top prospect for the Twins for possibly close to half a decade, which is, in my opinion, one of the more frustrating things to do as a fan.
Yeah. Speaking of guys who are probably going to take a little while to get to the big leagues, the next two guys on our list are some other high A starting pitchers. Those being Charlie Soto, who the Twins took in the supplemental round in 2023, and Dason Hill, who the Twins took in, I believe, the second round, or it might have been the supplemental round in 2024. These are both guys who have big stuff and have been really good in the minors, but it's just about building up their workload, refining some of their control, getting these guys to use their big raw stuff in the zone, and then getting them to develop as they move up the ladder. For both of these guys, we don't expect to see them anytime within even the next year or two. They're probably 2027, 2028 type of arms, but they're both guys who could develop into frontline starters, mid rotation guys. They have the kind of stuff and upside to be real impact playoff starters. It's just going to be a while for them to get there. Dason Hill is one that I think the Twins got a pretty good deal on. They took him in the second round, signed him for an overslot deal. And he's a Texas lefty at 6'5". I think he was like $180 when they drafted him. And he has really filled out and added about 8 miles an hour to his fastball. He was a guy that a lot of teams were very interested in the draft because it was widely thought that there was some low-hanging fruit for his development there, and the Twins have been able to capitalize on that. And for Charlie Soto, he's a guy who's throwing 100 out of high school, and the Twins drafted him, but they've just been able to get him on the mound more consistently, and get him to develop some of his other pitches to the point where we feel like there's a few potential plus pitches in his repertoire. It's just about keeping him on the mound and getting him to control those pitches in the zone.
The one thing I really like about both these guys is they kind of fill the opposite mold of a lot of the pitchers in recent Twins development history in terms of their profile. We've been seeing guys like Bailey Ober and Simeon Woods Richardson, and to a much greater extent, Zebby Matthews, who are really control command artists that the Twins have felt they can build up a lot of velocity in, and they've proven to be very good in that. And now we're going to see if they can do the opposite, where they're taking their shots on some of these guys with big arm talent, guys that don't need to really be taught how to throw as much. And instead, they're going to bank on being able to, like Matt said, turn them into really controllable and stable pitchers. And I think that's a great balance to strike in any organization because it's really a place that allows pitchers to feed on each other, then, where you've got a lot of guys in the low minors right now, like Charlie Soto and Dason Hill, who need to learn a lot of the traits and qualities that the guys at the top of the top of the minor leagues, guys that they'll presumably be working with one day, already possess. And I think that should hopefully be a big boon to their development themselves.
Now moving back into some upper minors guys, we have first Gabriel Gonzalez. He was the headliner of the Jorge Polanco trade. He's a right-handed hitting corner outfielder, kind of similar to Emmanuel Rodriguez, just in stature, where he's kind of a heftier built 5'10" outfielder, except where Erod is extremely athletic and can be a plus defender even in center field. Gabriel Gonzalez is more of an average to a half step below average defender who's locked into a corner. He's probably not a guy that you love having out in the grass consistently, but he's at least a good enough player to stick out there. However, his bat is somewhat questionable. He has a very good hit tool. He consistently posts high batting averages. He sprays the ball all over the field, lots of singles and doubles. But he's sometimes a little bit over aggressive. He doesn't walk a whole lot. And that's also troubling considering he doesn't get to a lot of power. And so if you think about stereotypical corner outfield, first base, DH type of guys, we see a lot of power hitters that walk and strike out. Gabby Gonzalez is kind of the opposite of that. And I just don't know that he's going to have the sort of on base numbers or power to justify plugging him in the corner outfield consistently with below average defense. He does offer kind of a natural platoon option for all of the left-handed hitters we've already talked about. Obviously, Walker Jenkins and Emmanuel Rodriguez higher on this list, but also the left-handed hitting outfielders already on the Twins team with Larnick, although he's probably not a long-term answer, but also Matt Wallner, Alan Roden. There's a lot of left-handed hitters, and so Gabby Gonzalez at least offers the option to be a kind of short side platoon bat in the near future.
I think that the lack of defense is certainly something the Twins have shown that they're not that concerned about. It's been a while. I mean, obviously we had Max Kepler, but outside of him, been a while that we've had, I would say, star outfielders in our corners. There's been, a lot of Wallner and Larnick and Eddie Rosario. And, I mean, some weird years where Gilberto Celestino was out there doing God knows what. But I think the interesting part here for Gabby Gonzalez, as Matt mentioned, he did not come up through the minors as much of a power hitter. And that certainly proved true in 24 after the Twins acquired him, which is why he dropped off from being a fringe top 100 prospect nationally to fringe maybe top 30 prospect for the Twins. But something clicked for him in 2025. He matched at every level, finished the season with a 513 slugging percentage, played all the way from high A ball to triple A, and matched for an over 500 slugging percentage at every stop. It's still not the traditional type of power that you would like to see from your power hitters coming out of the minor leagues. He did only get around to 15 home runs in 123 games and almost 500 at bats last year, but he did use his speed to his advantage, racking his way up to 38 doubles over that same time frame. And I think that that's just going to be the mold that he has to try and chase in the major leagues. I don't know if he is ever going to be a big home run guy like Matt touched on earlier, but I think that if he can be just a line drive machine, if he can just continue to have very high quality hard contact hits, that's going to play somewhere in the major leagues. It just always does.
Yeah, although Gabby Gonzalez is one of those guys, like this general profile always seems to stall out when it gets to the big leagues. And part of it is the better defense that you see in the major leagues. So he has posted a slugging percentage over 500 at every stop this past season, but a lot of that's driven by his batting average. So he had a 513 slugging percentage, as you said, but that's driven by a 329 batting average, which means that his overall isolated slugging percentage is a 184, which is pretty bad. It's not terrible, but it's very much not what you would expect for a corner outfielder. And again, that's with him running a 329 batting average. That was primarily driven by a 364 BABIP. So his BABIP has been very high to even support a less than stellar batting line. Well, at least as far as slugging. But if we see that BABIP drop to more of a league average 300-ish level, which is where he was at in 2024, that line can now drop precipitously. And he could be down to, I don't know, maybe a 270 hitter who gets on base at 320, 330 clip, and maybe a 400 slug, which is not going to be a guy that you want to play in the corner outfield. And he's also not a guy that we would expect to have a high BABIP just because he's not a very fast player. Yes, he hits a lot of line drives, but it's kind of a tough profile. It's a real fine needle to thread for a guy whose only real carrying trait is his bat to ball skills, and everything else leaves a lot to be desired.
I will say for Gabby Gonzalez, he's not necessarily old for where he's at in his career. He's only 21, so to reach AAA last year has him right on schedule with the guy you would hope to be a decent prospect for your organization. But I kind of still get the feeling that he needs to get an opportunity this year and show something with it if he's really going to ever find his way in this Twins organization. I think he's arguably more ready right now for the major league level than their guys like Walker Jenkins and Emmanuel Rodriguez are. But I don't think he really ever gets his day in Twins territory if he can't beat those guys to the major leagues. Because once they're there, they're going to be undeniably better talents that I would rather see playing over Gabby Gonzalez.
Yeah, agreed. And generally, when we get to this level of prospect, these are guys who have big question marks, and the organization's not going to go out of their way to clear playing time for them. At this point, it's once this guy gets an opportunity, he might only get 75 or 100 games in the big leagues, or he might get 100 innings to throw on the mound. And it's going to be really important for them that they are producing in that 100 games or 100 innings to be able to stay in the plans going forward. So Gabby Gonzalez, a guy that has some upside, a lot of question marks, but we'll probably find out one way or another pretty soon. Now we have a bunch of pretty interesting but close to the big leagues pitching prospects. I think the group that I want to talk about is Andrew Morris, Kendry Rojas, and Mick Abel. These are all guys who we think the Twins are going to keep as starters, at least for the short term. They're all in AAA. Mick Abel has actually made it up to the big leagues already. But these are all guys who have some upside, especially Rojas and Abel. We saw Abel at times last year touching up to 100 with his fastball. He throws 5 different pitches, although the effectiveness of any of his off-speed pitches is questionable, as well as his ability to throw the ball in the zone. He's run walk rates above 10% at pretty much every level of the minors and majors. He's made strides as far as his strike throwing, but it's still suboptimal, especially for a starting pitcher. Last year, we saw a big uptick in his performance in AAA. He started striking more guys out. He had a pretty low ERA for what it's worth, and he was somewhat productive in the big leagues. I think he's a guy who's pretty high upside if they can refine some of the secondaries and get him in the zone, but also a guy that there's a lot of relief risk with. Kendry Rojas, similarly, he's a guy who, from the left side, has come a long way in the Toronto organization. There's a lot of thought that he could be sort of a mid-rotation starter. He has great stuff, and he really struggled to find the zone after joining the Twins last year. Hopefully, he can be another candidate for a call-up this season, but for him, it's going to be about finding the zone consistently. And then on the opposite end, a really low variance guy is Andrew Morris. He has much less effective stuff, but he commands it in the zone. And he's just kind of a ready made 4th or 5th starter. I think if you gave him 150 innings in the big leagues, he would produce somewhat at the level of like a Simeon Woods Richardson does currently. He'd fill up the zone and just be a solid back end starter, but doesn't really have the upside for much more. What are your thoughts on these 3, Eric?
We were talking about a Scott Diamond type of player earlier. Obviously, the Twins didn't pick him up in the Rule 5 draft, but Andrew Morris, to me, has a Scott Diamond type of pitcher written all over him. He's, as you said, a lot more high floor, low ceiling than the rest of the guys. I am slowly starting to fall out of love with him. I think originally when he was coming up with a more exciting group of names and Zebby Matthews and Marco Raya and David Festa. And although Marco Raya has not gotten to the major leagues with Andrew Morris yet, I think it speaks a lot to the belief the Twins have in Andrew Morris, that out of that kind of trio of Festa and Zebby and Andrew Morris, that Morris will be the last one to debut for the Twins. I think there is just not a lot of upside to wish on there. And the tough part behind that is there is not a lot of translatability to the bullpen for him, like I think there is for Abel, and I think there is for Kendry Rojas. I would like to see Rojas and Abel pushed more aggressively this year as part of my larger idea that the Twins need to figure out sooner rather than later which of these starting prospects are actually going to remain starters for the team at the major league level. So to me, Abel and hopefully Kendry Rojas are both guys that we're going to see early and often in 2026, and we'll be able to have a lot more definitive idea of by even the midseason trade deadline.
Yeah, I will say, for guys like Andrew Morris who have really good pitch ability, they command the zone well, and they throw multiple average-ish pitches. We have seen those guys have the ability to tick up in the bullpen. I think the Twins in particular have had a few guys like this where their stuff just reaches a whole nother level. So, like when he was a AAA starter, we could have said a lot of the same things about Taylor Rogers. He was just kind of a run of the mill back end starter. Twins moved him to the bullpen. He added some velo and became a really good late inning option. Same could be said about Griffin Jacks. If you remember when he first came up, the Twins gave him like 10 or 15 starts in the big leagues down the stretch of one of their bad years. He got absolutely pummeled. Like I think he had a 6 or a 7 ERA. He was terrible. And I remember at the time, people were wondering whether he would keep his 40-man spot. And then the next year, they moved him to the bullpen, and he was immediately a setup option and eventually moving into one of the better relievers in the American League. And so I'm not saying that that'll necessarily happen with Morris, but I think the Twins, he's one of the guys that would make sense for the Twins to move to a bullpen role if they're not going to be able to use him as a back end starter, because he could have that stuff tick up and be a pretty solid reliever.
I do think that one upside along with that comparison you gave us to having a deep repertoire and arsenal in the bullpen is it allows a guy to be a bit more of a neutral platoon type of pitcher. I think a lot of guys nowadays are truly starting to develop into specialist left-handed and right-handed arms that you're pressing and pulling in specific situations for specific hitters. I do think if you want to point to something that Andrew Morris does well and has upside in, with the amount of offerings he has, I think he could, if he develops all those pitches a little bit better to become a bit more effective out of the bullpen, be a guy that you can kind of throw as a blanket fire hose at any mess that you might need to cover up, mop up in a game. And there's certainly a lot of value to that, even if you ever never ends up being an elite arm out of the bullpen. If he can at least be a neutralizer to both sides of the plate and a guy that you feel like you can trust in almost any situation, I think that would be a great outcome for the Twins.
Yeah, agreed. One more guy that we keep referencing, and we should probably talk about at some point, is Marco Raya. He's a guy who's been in the Twins organization for a while. He's always been seen as a guy who has really good raw stuff, but he's sometimes struggled to stay on the field. And even in the last couple of years where he's been mostly healthy, that's been reflected in his workload. For most of last year, the Twins limited him to 3 to 5 inning starts, mostly shorter appearances, where he was pretty effective, but it's hard to really say that he's a starting pitcher because he was really used more like a swingman throughout the minors. He, I think, has the stuff that he can play in the bullpen. And again, I don't know that he's ever going to have the kind of durability to be a real big league starter. So hopefully we'll see him in the big leagues being able to use his raw stuff to his advantage. And I think that'll happen yet this year.
So Marco Raya, I mentioned him and Andrew Morris in the sense that they're both kind of the last in that first wave of pitching prospects the Twins have had to come up. He, in a lot of ways, reminds me of Griffin Jacks, a guy who also had nice offerings, threw them pretty well, and had a pretty deep arsenal, but ultimately labored through the top end of the minor leagues, was not a particularly shiny starter prospect when he came up, and was very quickly moved to the bullpen where he found a lot more tremendous success. And I think that in an ideal world, that's going to be the same kind of game plan we're seeing for Marco Raya out of the Twins. He could start the season as a potential starter, either in AAA. I would be shocked to see him do it in the major leagues right out of the gate. But I do think he's a guy, 23 years old, who's already kind of aging out of AAA, that could be one of those prime candidates for the Twins to look at come February when they still have 3 bullpen spots open and say, well, we weren't really planning for it, but there's enough of a fit and more importantly, enough of a need that Marco Raya could at least get a chance right out of the gate and the bullpen. And I think that would be my preferred option for him in going forward.
Yeah. One last guy of the better prospects in the Twin system that we haven't touched on yet is Merrick Houston. Twins took him 16th overall this past draft. He's out of Wake Forest. He's a guy who put up big numbers at the plate in his senior year, but Wake Forest kind of plays in a bandbox of a stadium, and he hasn't necessarily been a great hitter in the past. He's a guy who, playing in a small park with metal bats, probably ups his power tool more than it should. But there's a thought that he can maybe be like a big league average hitter, but he is a very good defensive shortstop. That's the reason the Twins took him as highly as they did. The hope is that he can be a real plus or even like top of the grade defender at short while also being a decent enough hitter. And, maybe his power does come along or he develops more of a hit tool to be more than just an average hitter. But really, the whole goal for Houston is that he is just an exceptional defender and he can be good enough in the field that it outweighs his bat.
To me, we're really looking at kind of the anti-Kalen Culpepper here, a guy who is coming into the organization immediately with more questions than answers about his bat. But just because of how stellar he is defensively, I think this is a guy that we could really see moving quickly through the organization. I think a lot of times when you have that strong defensive foundation, it's easier for you to be justified in getting more playing time, even if the bat isn't up to speed. Because I think that you look at Merrick Houston, and he's arguably almost an MLB caliber shortstop defensively right now today. Not that his bat is anywhere near as ready to be at the major leagues. I think that in an ideal world, he would be a guy that could get another 2 to 3 years in the minor league, still working on his bat, kind of trying to develop into less of a one-dimensional player. But as I mentioned, he's already 21 years old. He doesn't have the most time in the world to meddle around in the minor leagues. I think that 2 to 3 year runway would be about the most I'd be willing to give him, but especially as a first round pick, I think you got to look at this defensive ability and hope that he's just going to be a fast mover through through the minor leagues, bat or no bat.
Yeah, agreed. There's one more guy kind of in that similar mix. Another compensation first rounder a few years ago named Kyle DeBarge. He's very interesting because he is a 5'9" infielder. He's another just pure defense and speed guy. He's one of the fastest players in the Twins minor leagues, and he's another plus defender in the field. He also has a very good bat to ball skills. So the hope with him is that he can spray it around, hit for a high average, and be a good defender. But again, I mean, he's a 5'9" infielder. There's not a lot of power there. He's kind of a high floor, low ceiling guy. Potentially more of a utility man who just plays great defense wherever you stick him.
Holy Nick Gordon clone. That is everything that I heard about that little write up, which I think is very spot on, very well said. But there's a reason that he's never really been able to crack that kind of top end of the Twins farm system rankings. And he's a guy that never really will. And there's not always like no value to a lot of those guys because obviously we saw a lot of good years out of Nick Gordon in Minnesota. I think that Kyle DeBarge is one of those guys that will never be a true difference maker at the MLB level, but every good team still loves to keep him on the roster just because he'll be able to do all of those intangible, unteachable things so well.
Yeah. While we're getting close to the end of time, there's a bunch of other interesting arms in the Twins minor leagues. The main guy I want to talk about is Riley Quick. The Twins took him in the second round last year, also out of Alabama, also coming off an injury. If that sounds familiar, it's exactly Connor Prelip's track. He was, I think, a 4-star football recruit at tight end. He's 6'6", 255. He's an absolute unit on the mound. Fastball runs up close to 100. He's a guy who's very high upside. He has a great fastball slider and a decent changeup. And he's pretty likely to he's one of the likeliest guys in this Twins farm system to develop into a high end starting pitcher. But he's also another guy who might end up just being a reliever, especially coming off of injury. He has exceptional stuff, and so it's exciting wherever you put him. But another guy that's probably going to be a while just because he's coming off such a large injury.
A few guys I want to give a quick shout out to. The first one we've touched on a little bit this offseason as we've talked about some of the Twins' past moves, but Hendry Mendez, a guy that I've mentioned I really like as a potential first base option for the Twins. Really kind of crushed it at Double A post trade last year, and I think he'll certainly start the season in Triple A. I would be a little upset if he doesn't, and he doesn't necessarily have the career power or profile to match the output he put up last year. But if the Twins were able to unlock something in him post trade, I think that's a sneaky guy that we could see making an impact on the Twins this year. Another guy who I really kind of like as a bit of a boom or bust prospect. Wow, is Brandon Winokur. He has not put up great numbers so far in the minor leagues playing shortstop for the Twins. He had a 692 OPS as a 20-year-old at high A last year, but 60 grade power, 60 grade run, 60 grade arm. He's the type of guy who, if he could just take the lowest end of his poor talents, like his hit tool and to some extent his fielding tool, certainly not a guy I expect to stay at shortstop, and make them serviceable, there's some pop and some speed that could make him a very entertaining baseball player, if not maybe a very elite baseball player.
Yeah, and the Twins have been playing Winokur kind of all over. I think this past season he mostly transitioned to the outfield where he's playing in the corner a lot more. But it is interesting that even a guy at 6'6", 220 could play shortstop at any point in the minors. He is kind of a freak athletically. He just needs to work on that hit tool for any of it to matter. That about sums up a lot of the interesting prospects / guys who could play an impact in the next year or so. I think one thing we already kind of mentioned, but I think it further highlights some of the Twins' deficiencies right now. Hendry Mendez, who Eric just talked about, is the only guy on this list who plays first base. And he is at MLB.com listed as the Twins' 25th prospect, and at Fangraphs at their 31st prospect. So he's a guy that we think is somewhat interesting for the Twins' first base opening, but he's by no means a top prospect. And he's their best option outside of Cody Clemens in the organization right now. So that really just shows how much of a black hole that position is currently. Yes, there's the option that they could always move a guy like Royce Lewis or Luke Keeschel over to first if they need to. But I think that really highlights why Eric and I have been pounding the table so much for the Twins to bring in an external third base option or first base option. They just really need someone with more talent than Hendry Mendez and Cody Clemens.
I certainly don't mind a team that stocks its farm system the way the Twins have. I know it gets a bit frustrating seeing us take what feels like a very similar form of shortstop or generally defensive offensive minded prospect every year, but at the end of the day, it's at least a clear and consistent plan, which makes the rest of your team building easier. I think that's my favorite part about this farm system is we know exactly where we do and don't have strength. There's not a lot of in between, but that, like I said, makes for pretty easy roster building at the major league level too.
Yeah, I mean, the idea that you're going to want to supplement your team at first base, DH, and relief pitching, it's like those are the three most plentiful spots to add guys who are high upside, high impact, and are cheap because the available pool of talent for guys who can be an above average hitter and play first base is pretty large versus shortstop. There's only a handful of guys in the world who can be good defenders there while also being true impact hitters. And so I think staffing the minors with mostly up the middle players makes sense. But at some point, somebody has to play first base, and you need to have a way to get a first baseman, whether that's by trading some of your middle infield options or by paying up for one in free agency. You need a first baseman. You need to have some way of getting that first baseman. And right now, it's not clear that they're doing that. And I will say they did take one big swing at a first baseman a couple years ago. I think it was the 2020 COVID draft when they took Aaron Sabato in the first round. And he has since absolutely cratered. He hasn't hit through any level of the minors. He made it up to AAA last year and put up some semi intriguing numbers, but behind it was a massive strikeout rate. And he's unlikely to ever even be in the big leagues for the Twins. So that highlights why you don't take first round right handed hitting first baseman because they just have to hit. Otherwise, none of the profile works. But it's just frustrating because they have such a clear hole there, and I don't know if they're going to address it.
But that's why I don't mind them building the way they do. Like you just said, I can't think of honestly a single first base primarily prospect that we've seen come out of the top end of the draft this decade so far that has been able to meet or even exceed their standards other than maybe Spencer Torkelson, who's had himself a pretty good bounce back year for the Tigers this year. It's just such lofty expectations that to me it feels a lot like the young unproven catcher type of archetype that Eduardo Tate is in, where there's always going to be lofty expectations no matter how the performance actually is. So they just have to be good because there's no other opportunities for them to move up.
Yeah, and I mean we've seen even like higher upside guys miss at first base. Like you mentioned, Spencer Torkelson. Another one I would say is like Andrew Vaughn. Both guys who were drafted in the first round were huge prospects, and neither of them really hit. I mean, last year was, I think, Torkelson and Vaughn's fifth year in the big leagues. And they both had resurgences, like especially once Andrew Vaughn went to the Brewers. But they didn't do a whole lot of anything leading up to that. And honestly, I was surprised that Andrew Vaughn got tendered a contract last offseason. And those were the absolute top of the scale college first base options, which should be the safest of first basemen. So it makes sense. But at some point, I would like to see the Twins package some up the middle guys and go after a proven big league first baseman or sign someone. Because, like I said, there's no help on the horizon. I think that's pretty much going to do it for us today. Eric, do you have any closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts, not a ton. I have spent this entire time thinking about how excited I am for next week's pod episode, just because I think this is going to be the first week where we see a large amount of movement and chatter coming out of the off season. So I think that coming back next week, we're going to have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, agreed. Like I said, the winter meetings is always a lot of fun. So we'll be back to keep you posted on all of those moves. I'm sure the Twins will do a few things of note. We'll at least know about the Rule 5 draft as well as the draft lottery. So we'll keep you updated on all those developments, if the Twins make any moves, and just generally what we're seeing around the league. But until then, we'll see you next time.